Let's talk about the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is rich and full of the Old Testament story, God's story from the beginning of time up until now. It has so much to teach us. So in this video, I'll give you an introduction to the genre of the author, the design of the book. It's written in 5 exhortations or 5 messages, a lot like the book of Matthew is parsed up and split up into 5 messages. Hebrews has 5 exhortations. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about who the audience could be. And then I'll bring you into the first exhortation and explain its exposition and exhortation, how that is designed. This framework will give you a simple way to understand the depth and complexity and richness that's in the book of Hebrews for us. It is going to be an exciting journey for us. So that's what's going to be in this video. So as we start, let me get you orientated first to where does Hebrews fit inside of the whole Bible, and specifically where does it fit inside of the New Testament? So there's 66 books in all of the Bible. There's 27 of those that are in the New Covenant, that is the New Testament. And in that New Testament, there are 3 main sections of authors in the New Testament. So the Pauline letters, that is Paul. He has early letters, middle and later letters. And then we have the Corpus Apostolicum. Now that makes up most of Peter's letters and all of John's letters. But if you take those two and split them, there's the Johannine literature, which is John's literature, John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and then Revelation. Those are pretty straightforward, those 2 sections. But the 3rd section is the Petrine Circle. Now, the Petrine Circle is those who are associated with and in the circle of influence of Peter himself. So we've got James, who's the brother of Jesus, and Jude, who's the other brother of Jesus, and 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st Peter really being the core of the Petrine Circle. So refer to the 1st Peter video to understand more about how 1st Peter is to the Petrine Circle like Ephesians is to Paul's letters. And then we have the letters of Mark, the letter of Matthew, and the letter of Hebrews. So Mark very much was Peter's co-worker, and he wrote the Gospel of John Mark. And then Matthew also wrote to the same as all these other authors in the Petrine Circle to dispersed Jews, those who were dispersed and scattered throughout the empire. They came on Acts 2 and experienced Pentecost, and then they went out and started their churches as families in this new tradition. Now it's 30-some years, 3 decades later after Pentecost, and they are getting pressure from the culture, and they're getting pressure from their own traditions, the Jewish traditions, the Old Covenant traditions, to come back and give up this newfound faith. And so Peter and his associates write these letters to establish them and encourage them to remain in the faith. That is where the book of Hebrews fits. So let me switch over here now and go to the book of Hebrews itself, and let's work on an introduction for you. So if I zoom out here, you can see, it gets a little hard to see, but we have the introduction of Hebrews here, and then we have 5 exhortations. 1, 2, 3, 4 actually has, it's so much content split into 2, and then the 5th one here. So what we'll be focusing on is just the introduction of Hebrews here and its first exhortation. So the book of Hebrews, as an overall purpose statement, it is written to encourage the Jewish churches scattered throughout the Roman Empire. I just got done talking about this concerning the whole Petrine Circle, where it fits, who are in danger of turning back from their newfound faith through a powerful word of encouragement. That's the phrase that the Hebrews author uses in chapter 13, his purpose statement. A powerful argument that progressively unfolds. We'll talk about how these 5 exhortations unfold progressively through an alternating pattern of exposition that is explaining something, and exhortation, which is a directive, in 5 sermons that are deeply rooted in the Old Testament. And it's telling them to progress through their difficult, desperate situation that they're in and the impending crisis that's coming forward and coming up in the days ahead, and to move towards full maturity. That is a paragraph of what the summary statement of Hebrews is about. It's deeply rooted in a lot of Old Testament quotes and understanding. The author of Hebrews knew the Old Testament very well and knew how it unfolds into the New Covenant today. So who's the author? Where to put it in the canon? Who's the audience? When was it written? What was the author's purpose? Let's go through those briefly now. Who is the author? No one knows for sure, but there's a growing opinion that Barnabas wrote it, who was martyred in 61 AD, and maybe then John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark was Peter's co-worker, maybe compiled it further after Barnabas's death, a lot like how Mark worked with Paul after Peter died in the winter of 68, when you see in 2 Timothy, Paul talking about how John Mark was useful to him and to bring his coat and to bring his parchments. Very likely they worked together as they Luke put his work together. Paul was putting his final part of his letters together with 1 and 2 Timothy. So we don't know for sure, but that's the growing opinion. Where to put it in the canon? It's part of Peter's circle of letters. I've just talked about that in the introduction. Who is the audience? There's 3 major cities at the time that they would. There'd be others this is an inclusive list, but these would be the major cities at that time that could have received this letter, and that would have been Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Rome. When was it written? Very likely during the same time as many of the other Petrine Circle of letters, so sometime in the 60s. This would be before the fall in 70 AD of Jerusalem, and this is 3 decades after Christ went back up into heaven. So keep that in mind, that they've been living for 30-some years in this new covenant, and it's growing with clarity as the Spirit leads the apostles with clarity in Christ's teachings and what he's doing in this age. They're living in this time, but it's been 30-some years, and some of them thought Jesus would have come back by now, and so they're growing wary, and they're getting a lot of pressure from their culture and from other Hebrews. What's the author's purpose for writing this book, this letter? It says in 13:22-25, bear with my word of exhortation. There, it's very much his purpose statement in chapter 13. And exhortation has a range of meanings. It means to encourage and comfort, but on the other end of the range of its meaning, it means to demand from someone or to admonish them, to tell them to set things in order. Very much a directive. So it is an encouragement, but it's also a direct instructions on what you're to do. That is why he wrote the book of Hebrews. So again, we can take from that ourselves that we should be comforted and encouraged, and we also should know that there are commands, if you will, demands on us as followers of Christ to live according to his plan. It's part of the Petrine circle of letters. We've talked about that, but First Peter is really the manifesto or the core piece of all the Petrine circles of letters. So Jude, Mark, 2 Peter, James, Hebrews fits on the outside here. So does Matthew. And all of them are focused on building a strong community of minds. 1 Peter 3:13 through 5:14 is the arm yourself with the same intentions. That's the core thrust of the Petrine circle, is to build strength in your mind to live in these difficult cultural situations, and also to focus on the second and third generations of churches. Remember, they're 3 decades into this newfound covenant, this newfound faith. The apostles are coming to clarity with the Spirit is giving them. They're writing these letters as a way to establish the churches and to tell them to remain in the faith. And so that's how we are to interpret and use them today to establish ourselves, establish our churches, establish leaders to follow Christ's plan that was unfolded by the apostles. How is the book structured? Very simply, it has 5 sections, 5 exhortations, because that's his purpose statement in 13:22-25. Bear with my word of exhortation. You can call these 5 exhortations. Every exhortation starts with an exposition. An exposition means an encouragement to give a fuller explanation, to give context to what he's going to tell them to do, an admonition or a clear directive. So first comes an exposition, then comes an exhortation, every single one. These are like Lego blocks. They build on each other. So the first exhortation is made up of these 2 parts, 1:1-14, and 2:1-4. And I've summarized them here in this box. Pay greater attention and do not drift away. Do not drift away from what? Well, we're going to look at that in a minute with the first exhortation we go through. So this is a summary chart of all the 5 exhortations. This would be something you really need to know before you can teach anything out of Hebrews. You need to know this context and what the author is doing, his purpose, and how he organized his letter, so that we can interpret what the Spirit wants for us to do. That is an introduction to the book of Hebrews right there. Now, let's move into the first exhortation. Exhortation number 1. It's chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 4. This first one is relatively short. This author uses a lot of words, but this first one is relatively short. The exposition, 1-14, 14 verses here, is how Jesus is unique. Let me zoom in for you so you can see a little bit better. Is unique and exalted Jesus. He's demonstrated by means of a whole series of Old Testament quotes. There's actually 7 Old Testament quotes. I've written them out here for you. You can pause and you can read these. The depth of these is so beautiful, and how he ties them in. These are connected, integrated principles that the author is bringing forth for us. This new covenant, everyone, is not a random thing. This is God's design. And that's what he builds on throughout the letter, especially when he gets into the 4th and 5th exhortation. In the 3rd one, he says, you're on weak milk. You're not going to be able to handle how Melchizedek was foreshadowing this new covenant. It's going to upset some of your traditions that you think that you're living in, same as it is with us today. But they're full of Old Testament quotes as a way to prove that this is what God's been up to the whole time. He's comparing Jesus to angels, that Jesus is identified as the one who's appointed Son, the one who rules as God, the one who is Lord and will reign forever and ever. Jesus has been exalted to the supreme position at the right hand of God, fulfillment of Psalm 110:1. That's what he's doing in the exposition. He's giving them a context. He's giving them an understanding of who Jesus is, and then he gives them this exhortation. What does he say? He says, therefore, we must pay greater attention to what we have heard. So they've been taught something in these 30 years, and he says we must pay greater attention. Well, this greater attention word has again this range of meanings. It means abundantly, much more, extremely, excessive. And attention is to take care, to give heed, to hold against, to hold firmly. And it also means then to not to drift away, to flow beside or past, to slip off, like a boat floating away from a dock. So what he's saying here in his exhortation, just simple four verses here, he's saying, pay greater attention to what we've heard so we don't drift away. So again, there's going to be a body of teaching that they've received that they must not drift away from. Pay greater attention to it. That's how you're going to withstand all of this desperate situation that you find yourself, and it's rooted in the Old Testament. So if we summarize the first exhortation in complete, we use the term exhortation to mean as an umbrella term, and then underneath of it is how it's designed is it's exposition first and then exhortation. So it can be confusing because you're using the same word to mean a major category and a subcategory, but we're following what the author has said in 13. So it's an exhortation with exposition and then exhortation's directive underneath that. What are the summary principles that we find in this whole exhortation then? Is long ago God spoke to them through the prophets, through the Old Testament, and then through his Son who created the world, appointed heir of all things. It's the exact imprint of God's being, sustains everything with his word. Let me zoom out here, and sits at the right hand of God. He's superior to angels. This is deeply embedded in the prophets of the Old Testament, as seen in all of those quotes up above here. I've got them listed, the 7 of them. And we know this is true through the complete word we've received from the apostles as recorded in the New Testament, recorded in their letters. Paul's collection, Peter's circle, Johannine literature. And that's what the Hebrews author is moving towards and mentions here. We have seen it in our lives, in our churches, especially the distribution of gifts in our gatherings. So it's interesting he's beginning to mention that, which ties it into all the other letters, especially into Paul's letters. And now he says in the exhortation part of chapter 2, we must anchor ourselves in our churches to the lives of the dock of this teaching. Anchor yourself. Do not drift away, and pay extraordinary attention to it. So you don't drift away, and you're not swept by the currents around us. You're not pulled off course. And this means paying close attention to the teachings of Hebrews so as to understand the amazing depth of the story, God's entire story from beginning to end, and fully integrating all that was spoken through the prophets and through the apostles in the New Testament, and bring that to the world. So you have the Old Testament prophets here, the New Testament apostles here. He's saying those are together. We must listen to this New Testament, to these new covenant apostles, the apostles that have written these letters, and they're explaining to us God's story, and we have to bring that into the world. So he's unfolding as the letter progresses. We get a fuller understanding of how the Old and New Covenant come together as part of God's story from the beginning. It's meat, is what he calls it. Solid food is what he calls it, but he's building us towards that point. Wow. The book of Hebrews is, let me come back here to the middle. The richness of the book of Hebrews. Our prayer and our hope is that as you move through this, you'll be able to see the integration of the Old Testament and with clarity, the new covenant directives of tying ourselves to the dock of teaching, tying our churches to the dock of teaching, so that we are all able to build our minds in a collection of minds that brings solidarity in our churches and solidarity in our communities to build Christ's kingdom as he instructed us. Okay, see you next time.